Good morning. Well, we resume our discussion of beauty. Those of you who remember that yesterday we looked at some of the problems that were associated with the modern conception of beauty, and we discovered that those problems were not so different in Lithuanian than they are in English, and I would say probably also in French and German, that they are, we have a terminology for beauty that was influenced very much by the development of the science or discipline of aesthetics. Aesthetics was the discipline dedicated, devoted to understanding beauty. It took beauty as its subject matter, and in this way elevated in a certain way and isolated a notion of beauty that then in its own right became problematic. And we looked at some of the problems that are associated with the modern notion of aesthetic beauty. So that's where we began yesterday. And so today we're going to look and see whether ancient Greece faced similar kinds of problems in their conception of beauty, or whether it was different. We even had a brief discussion of the fact that some cultures may not have a term for beauty at all. And that's a good lead-in to the problem that we have today. Because before we talk about Greek beauty and Greek ideas about beauty, we face a fundamental problem. Did the ancient Greeks have a concept analogous to what we call beauty? Now, serious scholars of the classical world have argued that ancient Greek possessed no word that unambiguously signified beauty or beautiful. There is a word that is most often translated as beautiful, and this is the word that scholars have studied when they are looking at concepts of beauty. And I have to tell you that for a little while, I'm going to be discussing some Greek terminology. This is necessary because once we have the Greek terminology clear, we can then see what it's used to express and what it isn't used to express. And then we can do the comparison. So I will make it as clear and as brief as I can. The word that is most often translated as beautiful is kalos. This is spelled, I will spell it in English spelling, K, kappa, alpha, lambda, these are Greek words, then in omicron, a short O, with an accent, and then S. So, kalos, one L, kalos. And you have that word in English, probably comes into Lithuanian too in some forms. Do you know the word calisthenics? To do exercise, the callus, the stem part, means strength. So exercise is beautiful strength or fine strength. We also have the word kaleidoscope, which is that thing that you turn, and the eyed part means an image, and so it's pretty images. Kaleidoscope and calisthenics. So, now, kalos can mean beautiful in particular contexts, but it's also applied to a lot of other things. For example, clothing, armor, manufactured articles, where we might think of these things as being well made. A kalos jacket, it could be a nice looking jacket, but it could also be simply well made. And then it's also applied to things such as laws, knowledge, and other abstract ideas. When you look up the authoritative Greek-English dictionary, you find under kalos meanings that include good, of fine quality, noble, and honorable. Now, if you add the definite article, the, to kalos, and then you put kalos in the neuter, kalon, you get top kalon, the beautiful. And that term is what the Greeks is often translated as beauty, the beautiful. You put the in front of it, and if you look that expression up in the dictionary, it will say beauty, but it also gives you the translation virtue and honor. So you see the problem. Here's the word that we're looking for the understanding of beautiful, but it also means virtue, honor, nobility, and many other things. Simply well-made. Now, words in common use normally have a wide set of connotations and sub-definitions, as you can see when you consult any dictionary. And just because kalos has a wide range doesn't mean that there was no meaning, beauty attached to the word. And classical scholars know this. Nevertheless, there was a recent issue about 3 years ago of a journal called Classical Philology, an important one, published by the University of Chicago. And it was on the subject, beauty, harmony, and the good. And Aryeh Kosmin, a very well-known scholar of ancient philosophy, who, by the way, looks just like Socrates. And Socrates was famous for not being beautiful, but okay. Aryeh, forgive me. In any case, he's a very good scholar, and here's what he says. He says, when he's looking at Aristotle, and he says that Aristotle's comments on the term kalos and related words, kalos, remember I keep that accent on the seventh, he says, they are only puzzling, confusing, and I'm quoting him, to the degree that we render kalon as beautiful and the kalon as beauty, or the beautiful. Since that's the only, if we translate them that way, then we get confusion. This is what Kosmin is pointing out. And he offers Aristotle's discussion of courage as an example. When Aristotle says that a courageous person does and acts as he does for the sake of the kalon. So when you are courageous, you are doing it for the sake of the kalon. And Kosmin points out that translators don't say when you're in battle, you're courageous for the sake of beauty. You're courageous for the sake of what is noble, what is virtuous, for what is fine, for some moral quality. And so that's the example. And Plato wrote a whole dialogue, which I won't go into in detail, called the Greater or Major Hippias, which is entirely dedicated to the word kalos and kalon. And Kosmin, after reading this, says there is a deep history of uncertainty about how properly to translate kalon. And he says, in conclusion, he says, the ambiguities associated with the term, and now I'm quoting him, leave me with the urge, desire, an urge that I will of course resist, to say that the Greeks had no concept of beauty. That's his conclusion. And then he adds, but this much is right. The concept of beauty is sufficiently different from the concept of kalon to make my urge understandable. So let's see very clearly what he's saying. He's saying, I have an urge to say the Greeks had no concept of beauty. Well, I won't say that. But why not? But I won't say that. What I will say is, whatever it was, whatever beauty was, it was different enough from this kalon, kalos, that you can see why I feel that way. And he goes on to note that various other features. Now, in the same issue of this journal, another scholar begins her paper by remarking how the fine is related to the good, in Plato's thought, is a puzzle. Now, what word is she using for fine here? Tell us. The same word. In other words, instead of translating it as the beautiful is related to the good, she says how the fine. Well, fine is a word in English. So why wide range of meanings. Not particularly, he's a fine person. This is a fine piece of poetry. We don't necessarily mean beauty. We just mean it's got good quality. So I am just illustrating exactly how Cologne is used. Terence Irwin, a very, very well regarded scholar of Aristotle and ancient philosophy, says Aristotle uses Cologne both to mean beauty and moral rightness. And yet, he says, when it comes to ethics, Aristotle only means moral rightness without any suggestion that morality and beauty coincide. So, no suggestion that they coincide. And then he says, if you want to use one term to translate Cologne, don't use beautiful, use either fine or admirable. And I have a number of other examples to show you the confusion, but let me conclude with Umberto Eco's comment in his book, A History of Beauty. This is a very nice gallery. It was actually accompanying a museum exhibit of works of art intended to illustrate beauty. Eco wrote another book on ugliness, which was accompanying another exhibit. It's like a catalog. And here's what he writes, Umberto Eco. He says, in fact, beauty had no autonomous stature in ancient Greece. No autonomous stature. What he means by that is it had no self-existing nature. It was part of a larger set of concepts. And then he says, Cologne, which only improperly may be translated by the term beauty, ought to put us on our guard. Now, the simple fact that there was no single word meaning beauty doesn't necessarily mean there was no concept, but it makes it much more difficult to identify what that concept was and what the Greeks might have meant by it. In other words, if Cologne is the only word for beautiful, and if it doesn't really correspond to beauty, it has too many other meanings, and we don't, it may be that part of it could identify beauty, but then we have a real problem figuring out what part. How did they identify beauty and what was relevant? And yet, despite Cosman's and Eco's doubts about whether the very notion of beauty existed in classical Greek, and they are representative of a very widely held view, there is in fact a classical Greek word that comes much closer to the modern notion of beauty. In fact, if Cologne is too wide, covers too many things, the word I'm thinking of is even narrower than the English term for beauty. So, what's the word and why don't people know it? After all, I can't be the first guy to have known this Greek word. And you'll see why as soon as I tell you the word. The word is kalos. Not kalos, but kalos. Now, you notice the accent is on the first syllable, not on the second, and also that there are two L's. I don't know whether in Lithuanian, I'm sure it's the case, double L sounds different from single L. Is that correct? When double consonants are used, or it sounds the same. Well, in English it also sounds the same. So I'm going to make it very pronounced. Kalos. In ancient Greek and in Latin, and in modern Italian, you hear the difference. Kalos and not kalos. So the reason, I think, that people didn't realize that there was a word that meant beauty is they said, well, kalos and kalos, they have the same root. They are. They come from the same origin. They must mean the same thing. But they don't. Kalos is a much narrower range of meanings. And what we're going to discover is that its primary meaning is in reference to human physical beauty. That's primary meaning of kalos. And once we know it, and in fact, above all, the beauty that is associated with erotic attraction. That's its primary significance. Like most fundamental concepts, kalos did evolve and shift its meanings over time, and it could be applied to such things as works of art, or rather specific aspects of works of art, and to certain kinds of speech. However, it appears, and here's a claim I'm making, it appears that kalos, the noun, not kalos, beautiful, but kalos, beauty, is never used to describe a painting or a poem as such, in the way we say that work of art is beautiful or that poem is beautiful. It's not used that way. And so, I believe that when the art historian Jerome Pollitt says in his very brief treatment, he says, the semantic range of kalos is as simple or complex as beauty or any other word denoting the same quality. He doesn't quite get it right, because we use beauty in contexts where the Greeks wouldn't use that noun kalos. Now, we'll come later tomorrow to the aesthetic uses of this term, but for the moment, let's take a look at actually how the term is used. So what I'm going to do now, I've got a pile of material here, and I could give run-through tons, but I'm just going to do Homer. Just take a few examples from Homer, from the Iliad and the Odyssey, about how kalos is used, and then, if you agree with me that this is an interesting word, and that it does pick out beauty, what we'll do then, today and tomorrow morning, is look at how that term is used, what its contexts are, because then we'll get a sense of how the Greeks understood beauty to work. So one of the things we're going to look at, I'll just give you a kind of anticipation, is the erotic context. We're going to look at whether gods can be beautiful or not, and if so, which ones? We're going to look at beauty and sexuality. Who is described as beautiful, and in what conditions? We're going to look at beauty and class. Are the upper classes more beautiful than ordinary people? Well, this is the range of questions that we can identify once we have a word that means beauty. And you can already see why the adjective, kalos, the one that causes all the problems, you can see why, if that adjective means noble, well, the nobility, the aristocracy, of course, will be described as kalos. That just means the nobility. Of course, the nobility is called noble. But does this mean that the Greeks thought noblemen and noble women were more beautiful than ordinary people? Well, we don't know, because we cannot see whether the adjective is distinguishing their nobility or their physical beauty. But when we get to kalos, if I'm correct that its range of meanings is much more narrow, that it is particularly associated with physical beauty and the kind that excites erotic desire, well, then we can ask the question, is the nobility described as possessing this feature? If they are, then we know the Greeks thought they were more beautiful. If they are not, then the Greeks thought there was no particular connection with being in the upper classes and being more sexually attractive. In fact, given some of the Greek ideas about sexuality, which we are going to look at, and many of you will know that the Greek culture had the feature of pederasty, the love of boys, as part of its sexual culture, the identification of an individual as beautiful and sexy wasn't always and necessarily a compliment. It would depend. It's a little bit like calling your, I don't know what, I'll give you an example. We think of kalos, fine word. Your priest, the archbishop, we'll call him here, the Pope, if you like. Well, Pope Francis, he's a fine guy. In ancient Greek, we could call him excellent, kalos, no problem. I don't know want to call him sexy. I don't say no, I don't say yes. I just think it's a question different from saying that he is noble. And once we get this distinction, we can see why Cosmin had the problem that he did, or Umberto Eco, when they were looking at kalos. So the problem wasn't that they got kalos wrong. The problem was they thought they already knew what kalos meant. And it doesn't mean the same thing. Let me just take a brief digression. How did I get started on this? Somebody asked me to write a chapter on beauty for a handbook on aesthetics. And this was about 4 years ago. And I wrote back and said, no, I have no idea what the Greek concept of beauty is. Well, this is a friend of mine from Belgium. The Belgians are very insistent, and he kept writing back. Yes, yes. Finally, I was meditating on it, and I said, I have a feeling, just a feeling from what I've read, that kalos is different from kalos. I didn't know it. So I set about looking at it, and right now I'll give you some of the pieces of evidence that I started to find and that led to this book. Really, that is the origin of the book. So, in the Iliad, the gods are said to have given kalos to a hero named Bellerophon. Now, not just kalos, but they've also given him a desirable, lovable manhood. They give him beauty and lovable manhood. Now, why Bellerophon? Because it's not very commonly used in the Iliad. Why Bellerophon? Well, Bellerophon was a guest at a king's home, and the king's wife, Stenavia, fell in love with him. She wanted him to have sex with her. He said no. So she denounced him to her husband, who then sent him with messages, that secret message that when he arrived at the next place, the king should kill him. Well, it all came out. But you recognize the story, some of you will recognize the story, from Joseph and Potiphar's wife in the Bible. The young man, the wife of his host, falls in love with him. When he doesn't respond, then she denounces him. Hippolytus, the Greek tragedy, has a similar kind of story. And in fact, Euripides also wrote a play about this episode, but it doesn't survive except in fragments and references. Now, why is he why is he referred to as an adjective, it's a noun, why is he said to possess, as a gift from the gods, kalos? Well, you see why. That's what made the wife of the king, of his host, fall in love with him. When you have kalos, it means that you are sexually attractive. This is important. Who else is beautiful in the Iliad? Well, you probably know a number of heroes in the Iliad. Achilles, Hector, a famous guy, Diomedes, Agamemnon. Not one of them gets the adjective kalos. Can you even imagine who it would be who would get it? Paris. Do you remember who Paris is? Paris is the one that Helen ran off with and caused the war in the first place. So in other words, why did Helen run off with Paris, sometimes also called Alexander, I like the name Paris. I don't know why he wasn't called Vilnius, but he was called Paris. And so why did Helen run off with Paris all the way to Troy and cause the war? She was married, she had a daughter, she abandoned everything in order to follow Paris to Troy. Then the Greeks created an armada and destroyed the entire city. Why? He's beautiful. That's what you fall in love with. You don't fall in love necessarily with Hector. Hercules never gets any women falling in love with him. He doesn't need to. He just goes and takes them. He's Hercules. That's what you do when you're Hercules. Don't fall in love with men. Men fall in love with women. Unless the men are very, very sexy. But Hercules is not that sexy. And I'm going to go into some of the images about who and why, when people are considered sexy and when they're not. But this is what you can find out. Now, is Hercules kalos, noble? Absolutely. All over the place. But he does not have kalos. And this is the kind of thing that was getting me to perceive that these words really are distinct, and we have to look at them. And it's very curious because there is no book anywhere, not even an article, about this now. And people have been reading about this stuff for a long time. So I made a discovery. Let's just say that. Well, who else do you think is going to be beautiful in the Iliad? We got Paris. Who else? Helen. Helen is beautiful. And she gets the word kalos applied to her all over the place. In fact, she is the standard by which other women are judged. Helen, Euripides wrote a play called Helen, where she turns out to be a nice girl in this play, but she thinks back on how her beauty has caused all the problems for her in her life. When, okay, so we got a guy who was particularly beautiful, we got a girl who was particularly beautiful, Helen. You may remember that Hector's wife is Andromache. There are beautiful scenes with Hector and Andromache. Just to remind you when Hector comes home and he's with Andromache, his wife, and their little baby. And he holds the baby in his hands, and the baby starts to cry because he sees him in his war helmet and his armor. And Hector takes off the helmet, and then the baby recognizes him and begins to smile. And Andromache, the beautiful line in Homer, says, she's laughing through her tears. Why the tears? Because she knows that this war is going badly. She knows things are going to come off terribly. Hector has told her just now, I know someday our city will be taken, and you will be carried off into slavery. And I hope I die before that day arrives. It's a beautiful scene, but she is not described as being beautiful. Helen is described as being beautiful. Now, let's go to the gods and the goddesses. Who do you think among all the gods and goddesses is likely to get beauty as her attribute? You already know. Aphrodite. Aphrodite, you remember the one we saw yesterday with the picture and the guy that abused the statue? We mentioned the guy that abused the statue. It's got to be Aphrodite. That's the one who is going to get beauty. There are other examples of beauty being used in the Odyssey. You may remember that in the Odyssey, Odysseus takes 20 years to get home, 10 years in the war and 10 more years. Along the way, he stops on his last trip. He stops off at the land of the Phaeacians. And the Phaeacians are going to carry him back home. But he's a stranger. He's naked, he's lost all of his ships, all of his men, he's by himself, he's been swimming for 3 days, and he finally gets to shore. And just by accident, a young princess, the daughter of the king and queen, has gone down to the sea to wash her clothes, and she is washing her wedding garments, not because she's married, or even going to get married, but she has a trousseau. She has a collection of clothing that she will wear when she's married. So their marriage is in the air. She's of an age to get married. She is described as having kalos. Then Odysseus comes up. He's been in the water for 3 days. He's got barnacles on him. He's looking horrible. But he has a protecting goddess, Athena. And Athena makes him look young and attractive. And she gives him kalos. Now, why would Odysseus get kalos at this point? He's a tough old hero. He's as tough as Ajax or Achilles or any of the others. Why did she give him kalos? Because she wants that young girl to be attracted to him so that she will protect him and take him to her father, the king, and introduce him and allow him to be safe while he's on that land. And then they will take him home. In fact, she looks at him. He's come swimming up. He's swum up naked, so he's covering himself with some branches and so on. She looks at him and she says, follow me to my palace, and I'll introduce you, but stay a distance behind, because the men up on the walls are going to look down at us, and if they see you next to me, they're going to say, aha, She is picking another man, a foreigner, for her husband. We're not good enough for her, are we? So you see, the entire context is one of enamorment, one of falling in love, one of, it's in the air. Now, in the end, he's going to leave her and go home and to his own wife, Penelope. And when he gets home, 20 years later, Athena will again make him look beautiful, because she wants that wife of his also to think of him as the man that she would like to be with. So this is the kind of use that we have. I can give you a few other examples. One of them is Ganymede in the Iliad and elsewhere. You know who Ganymede was? Ganymede was the cupbearer, the guy that would bring the cups around, the little waiter for Zeus, Jupiter, up in heaven. Jupiter fell in love with Ganymede. Ganymede, you can guess, how old was Ganymede when Jupiter fell in love with him? Was he the age of Pope Francis? No, he was not. He was a boy. He was young. So he has Kalos. And Jupiter, Zeus, falls in love with him and sends down an eagle, carries him up to heaven, gives him immortality, and from now on, he will be the cupbearer, the person who brings the wine cup around among the gods. So there's another example of it. In the Odyssey, we learn that a young man named Clytus was carried off by the goddess of dawn, who fell in love with him and carried him up to heaven. He gets Kalos. So if we're giving you a picture of the kinds of things that where Kalos is applied. Now the contrast between the noun and the adjective is sometimes emerges very clearly. And so let me give you an example. There is a poem in the corpus of poetry ascribed to Theocritus. Theocritus was a writer 200-something, 250 if you like, BC. And he wrote pastoral poems, largely. These are poems about shepherds and people falling in love and so on. Okay, so this is what he says. And in one poem attributed to him, he says, "A boy's beauty, kalos, is kalan, but it doesn't last long." Now listen to the way that phrase is. A boy's kalos is kalan. Now, if kalan means beautiful, then it says a boy's beauty is beautiful, which has no meaning. If it means fine or a good thing, then he's saying a boy's beauty is a fine thing, but it doesn't last a long time. Now, in what context would somebody say a boy's beauty is a fine thing, but it doesn't last a long time? What do you think he's saying? He is saying a woman's beauty is also a fine thing, but it lasts longer. Therefore, there's something to be said for heterosexuality. This is not just my invention. We have several ancient discussions comparing the value, erotic value, of boys as against girls and women. Absolutely, discussions, arguments between characters. And someone will take the view, boys are much better than girls if you want to fall in love with somebody. They're virtuous and energetic and athletic, all the commonplaces of antiquity. And then others will say, no, women are much better to fall in love with. And they'll give various reasons, but among them are that a woman retains her beauty as she gets older, whereas a boy's beauty passes quickly. Now, we might say, well, that's not necessarily true. A boy grows up, he could still look very handsome and so on. Notice that we are in the world of pederasty here, where the boys are attractive objects of sexual desire, not adult men. We'll come back to this example later, but that's the context in which Theocritus can say a boy's kalos is kalon, but it only lasts a short time. And then I have other examples from a variety of places where this kind of contrast between the two forms is clear. Now, what have we concluded so far? We've concluded that kalos, the noun, kalos, applies often to physical appearance and suggests an idea of sexual attractiveness. We've also noticed, or could notice, that sometimes the adjective kalos can refer to appearance. If it didn't, nobody would have wondered why, even thought about it as a word meaning beauty. But what happens is, when it is used that way, very often, not absolutely always, but very often, a woman, let's say, will be described as being kalos, the adjective, or kale in the feminine, in appearance. And so we can plausibly translate it, she's a fine-looking woman. She is fine in the way she looks. That specification lets us know that just as in English, if I say that's a fine-looking woman, I may very well mean she's beautiful. Whereas if I say it's a fine-looking horse that you have, or car, it's a fine-looking car, I can say that too. And I don't mean that car is sexually attractive to you. Unless, of course, we are thinking of autoeroticism, but that's a bad joke in English. I'll let you work it out. So, there's one interesting example that I'll come back to in the Iliad. Hector, there's one point in which Paris, our friend Paris, the guy that caused the whole war, is fighting Menelaus. That's Helen's husband. And they're having a duel, and they've decided whoever wins the duel, the war is over. We give it either to Paris or to Menelaus. Well, Paris is losing, and Aphrodite, who's his patron goddess, carries him off and deposits him in Helen's bedroom, so that they can have, in the middle of the day, what in colloquial English used to be called a nooner. You know, noon is midday, and I'll let you figure out the rest of it. Now, Paris finally comes back out, and Hector meets him. And Hector is irritated. He says that you are the most handsome of the Trojans, but you are not the best in battle. You avoid the battle, you hide out in your wife's bedroom and so on. And pretty soon after, he says, you have a kalon, that's the adjective, appearance. You look fine, but you're not really fine. You don't have the nobility that is supposed to be associated with a great warrior. And this is the kind of situation in which you find a contrast between Hector, who is the powerful warrior, great, and so on, and doesn't necessarily talk about his fine looks, and Paris, who is very beautiful, but is described throughout as not the best warrior, and in fact, a little bit hesitant. And when Hector criticizes him, Paris has a good answer. He says, look, you know, we all have our gifts. You were given great strength and courage. I was given my gifts from Aphrodite. We cannot despise any of the gods. That's the advantage of polytheism, right there. You've always got a god on your side. Okay, we have now seen more or less the way that kalos and kalos are used. I'll give you one or two more examples, and then we'll move on to something else. When in the play of Euripides, the Hippolytus, in fact, the woman Phaedra says, the women are terrible if they prefer pleasure instead of the kalon. What does she mean? She means if they prefer pleasure rather than honor. That's very, very clearly what she means. And in another play, also by Euripides, called the Andromache, this is named for the wife of Hector, Andromache says, the thing that gives pleasure to your partner in bed is not kalos, not beauty, but virtue. If you want to please your husband, you will please your husband not with your beauty, but with your virtue. And this is already a sign that, of which we will get more indications later, that the idea of beauty in ancient Greece could be understood to be an ambiguous or ambivalent kind of gift. Beauty is dangerous. It's dangerous in the same way that sexual attraction is dangerous. Helen is beautiful. And look what happens. She causes the war. She causes people to lose their heads. Beauty is a dubious kind of attribute. And we have many passages, I've collected a whole bunch of them, in which you see the problematic nature of beauty as the Greeks conceive of it. By no means is Andromache alone when she says beauty is not the object of not the way you really attract the man, not the virtue you ought to have. And when we come back to thinking tomorrow morning about beauty and class, one of the ideas that's going to be in our minds is the possible opposition between beauty and virtue. Now, I don't have to illustrate this in modern cases. We have some of the same prejudices. The prejudice that beauty and virtue may not go hand in hand. Or if they do, then it's difficult. We have many examples of women, including Helen, by the way, in plays, who curse their beauty. This beauty has led to all the problems that I face. They don't necessarily see beauty as a great thing to have. We've also described beauty as being the object of desire, so I think we can now start this. Well, now, you remember yesterday, we were looking at pictures of the Virgin Mary and of Judith in the biblical book of Judith, and also of Marina, the martyr who was, with whom the Roman governor fell in love, and then when she would not give up her religion, he tortured her. Her beauty remained unaffected, and finally he killed her. And we were looking at this tension in the description of a saint or of the Virgin Mary herself between the physical appearance, which could be beautiful and attractive, even to the point that with these martyred saints, the very reason they were martyred was that the governor fell in love with them because of their beauty. Or, in the case of Judith, that her beauty enabled her to disarm and seduce Holofernes, the foreign general, until she could cut his head off. And yet this has to exist in tension with her spiritual purity and nobility as such. Well, the Greeks also had their virgin goddesses. And most prominent among them are Athena and Artemis. Athena, we've already mentioned, she's the patron goddess of Odysseus, she's the goddess of wisdom, she's the goddess of handicraft, but she is also very frequently represented in a military guise. When you go to the, well, if you were to go in antiquity to the Parthenon, you would have seen the Parthenon, by the way, means the temple of the Virgin. Parthenos means a virgin in ancient Greek. And the Parthenon is the home of the Virgin. And who is the Virgin? It's Athena. Why Athena? She is the patron goddess of Athens. How is she represented inside? She's represented inside in full military guise, with a helmet, spear. That's the way you see her. And she wore the thing called the aegis. The aegis was made out of the Gorgon's head, and if you looked at it straight on, it would freeze you and turn you to stone. So she's a very powerful character. We would want to know then, is she going to be described as possessing beauty? Do we want to think of Athena as sexy? That's the kind of question that we can ask now. And as far as I can find out, I haven't found it even once applied to Athena. but a couple of times to Artemis. She's the other virgin goddess. She's the sister of Apollo, the guy out in the Hall of Classics building, who looks a little sexy in that statue, I have to say himself. He too is a female. But what about Artemis and her brother Apollo? One of the features of them is that they're young. Relatively young in comparison with Athena, who stands more really. The other thing is there are stories about her, and I'll go on to them and give you some examples. But first, let me quote a little poem written probably in the 1st century A.D. by a character named Rufinus, a little epigram. And he's talking to his beloved, and he says to her, "You have the kalos of Aphrodite. You're as beautiful as Aphrodite. You have the mouth of persuasiveness." In other words, she speaks beautifully. "You have the body and the youth of the spring season. You have the voice of Calliope." She's one of the muses. "You have the voice of Calliope. You have the mind and the modesty of Themis." She's an old-fashioned goddess of law and justice. "And you have the arms, not the weapons, but the physical arms of Athena. And the 4 graces are with you." So who gets Kalos? Aphrodite. Well, what about the arms of Athena? Why does she have Athena's arms? Well, Athena might have nice arms. I mean, you have the elbows of Artemis. I mean, it's a little bit, something getting a little off here. The knees of so-and-so, the toes of this one. It's not quite beauty. It's got to be something else. There's a list here. So why the arms? Well, Athena was the goddess of weaving. She was also the physically powerful goddess of warfare. She is represented always with that spear. In other words, you're a tough-looking girl, but you have the overall look of beauty that we're going to associate specifically with Aphrodite. Once again, if we were to use I think to say something like Aphrodite, or I'm sorry, Athena seems pretty or sexy, gets the wrong sense of it. Now what about Artemis? There are certain situations in which Artemis can be represented as more sexy. And the most characteristic one has to do with the story of Actaeon. Let me remind you of the story of Actaeon. Actaeon is out hunting. And while he's hunting, he comes across Artemis and he sees her bathing. So he sees her naked. When he does, she, like any goddess who is spied upon by accident, immediately turns him into a deer. And since he's hunting, his hunting dogs now don't recognize him as their master, and they tear him to pieces and kill him, because they think they caught the prey. So that's her revenge. Now this is a story that suggests erotic attraction. She's naked, a man has come and seen her, and in just this context, one of very few, you get kalos ascribed in just a couple of situations to her. As one writer named Michael Squire says that when you see paintings of Actaeon accidentally spying on the naked Artemis in her bath, in her fountain, her pose in the paintings resembles the pose of Aphrodite that we saw yesterday. In other words, she's covering herself, she's looking modest, she's looking like the sexy goddess. So in that context, yes, Artemis will be described as sexy, and so in those situations, you may find that term applied to her. But generally speaking, it is not. She's a virgin goddess, and that's not the way you want to have her represented. So what happens here is that we see that the Greek, and here's the critical thing, the Greek use of the term kalos doesn't lead to the same set of problems that we saw in connection with beauty. You don't have to ask, does Artemis have spiritual beauty? Does Athena have spiritual beauty? Kalos means they're sexy. Exactly and only what it means in these kinds of contexts. So it's what I meant when I said that if kalos, the adjective, which means fine, noble, good, virtuous, is too broad for beauty, The noun kalos is a little, it's narrower than beauty. But this really gives us a sense of how the Greeks understood at least one aspect of their culture. I'll give you one quick story about Artemis. He is praising the city of Antioch. This is a guy called Libanius, his slave, and he says Ptolemy, the ruler of Egypt, was smitten, means struck or overcome, by the beauty of Artemis. And that's what he says, and he carried her off to Antioch, his city in Syria, from Egypt. Now this is very interesting. He didn't carry off the goddess. What did he carry off? He carried off a statue. But he was smitten by the beauty of Artemis, and he carried off the statue. So what was he smitten by? Did he find Artemis beautiful, or did he find the statue beautiful, or did he find the statue a statue of a beautiful woman? You remember yesterday again, we were talking about if a must, when we look at a painting and we say it's beautiful, do we mean the thing in it is beautiful, or do we mean the painting is beautiful in spite of whatever the object represented may look like? I think it's ambiguous in the case of antiquity. I think what Libanius is telling us is that the king somehow fell in love with Artemis through her statue and wanted to carry her statue off because he was in love with this goddess so represented. And since this is transgressive, you don't carry off a goddess that you're in love with, and least of all Artemis, he gets punished in the end. That's the moral of the story. I will only take a couple more examples. Let me conclude in a slightly lighter vein with a story from Aesop, one of the fables. There is a female weasel. You know what a weasel is? It's like a little cat-like animal that falls in love with a handsome young man. So a weasel, similar to a cat, longer and wilder, falls in love with a man. And she prays to Aphrodite that she may be transformed into a woman. So she falls in love with a man's beauty, and she prays that she will be transformed into a woman. And Aphrodite takes pity on her and makes her into a very pretty girl. The boy, and here's what the text says, falls in love with her kalos, falls in love with her beauty, and brings her to his home. Unfortunately, the story does not have such a happy ending. Aphrodite decides to test whether the physical change from a weasel to a girl is accompanied also by a change of character. So what does she do? She sends a mouse into the room. The girl leaps up from the bed to chase the mouse and hopes to eat it, with the result that the goddess converts her back into her original form. But my point is simply that the girl's beauty is enough to inspire the love on the part of the boy. And I've got a number of stories of this sort. I'm just checking a few more. One last tale, and then we'll be done. And next time, I'll take up more the question of what happens when men are described as beautiful. This is going to be very interesting, and here we're going to get, it's only one part, we'll talk about men and beautiful, talk about class. I don't want to go into it too much right now because it'll take us a little bit more time, but let me just anticipate, and you can already imagine, that there will be a problem when you're dealing with adult men versus boys. Because if it's the case that beauty is sexually attractive, then if you have a society in which adult men fall in love with boys, you don't necessarily want to reverse it. You don't want boys falling in love with adult men. Why not? What are the consequences? What are the implications? This we'll look at tomorrow morning. But now, I want to end with just one curious story. And it has to do with so many examples here that I have to define. But this one, in Plato's Republic, there is a character named Leontius, who is coming home one day to Athens from Piraeus, and he sees some dead bodies lying on the ground. And he felt a desire, Plato tells us, to see them, and also disgust. For a time, he struggled, and he covered his eyes. But finally, the desire, now this is not eros, not erotic desire, just appetite, different word in Greek, got the better of him, and forcing his eyes open, he ran up to the dead bodies and said, "Look, you wretches, take your fill of this sight." And the sight is called kalon. Not kalos, but kalon, this noble sight. It's very ironic. Well, here's a case in which a man sees decomposing bodies. Something in him wants to look, and yet he doesn't want to look. And in Plato's Republic, Socrates says, that's how I can prove to you that the soul is divided, that it has parts. Because if it didn't have parts, then you couldn't both want to look and not look at the same time. So there's an appetite part, a lower part, and that's the part of you that wanted to look. And then there's the mind, the higher part, the virtuous part, that didn't want to look. Well, what is the difference, I was asking myself, between the one kind of desire, the disgusting desire to see this stuff, a dead body, and you yourself have sometimes had this kind of curiosity, haven't you? You're walking down the street, there's something really disgusting there, and you don't want to look, but take a peek anyway. And so, you know, it's an animal, it's like decomposing. It's natural, and you do have to ask yourself, what on earth makes us want to look at this stuff? So, is it that in some sense there's beauty there? Is every kind of desire a response to beauty? Because after all, I've said beauty produces erotic desire. But every time we feel any desire to look at something, does it mean it's beautiful? What happens when we want to look at an ugly thing? That was one of the questions that I asked myself. And I came across a very interesting passage with which I am going to end our story today. And this is in the life of Pericles, the great Plutarch was a writer of biographies, and he wrote biographies of various people, including Pericles, the great hero, leader of Athens in the 5th century BC. And he opens up his life as follows. He says, on seeing certain wealthy foreigners in Rome carrying puppies and young monkeys about in their bosoms and fondling them, so let me get clear here. This is Caesar, probably Julius Caesar, sees women carrying puppies and monkeys, but baby monkeys, in their bosoms and fondling them. Caesar asked if the women in their country didn't actually have children. In other words, why on earth are you carrying puppies around? It must be you don't have children back home. Now obviously this is ironic. Pet lovers from this point on can put their hands over their ears. I know that many of you think your dogs are beautiful, your puppies especially, and you may even have doubts about children. In any case, Caesar rebuked those who squander on animals. They waste on animals the love and affection which is ours by nature and due only to our fellow human beings. This is the way Plutarch describes Caesar's reaction. And then he goes on to say, Plutarch, since our souls are by nature possessed of a great fondness for learning and fondness for seeing, it is reasonable to chide, and that means to scold or to disapprove of, those who abuse this fondness on objects that are unworthy either of their eyes or ears, to the neglect of those which are good, kala, not beautiful, but kala, good, and useful. And he says, our outward sense since it observes anything that encounters it, must look at everything that presents itself. In other words, our eyes are walking down the street, and we have no choice. If it's there in front of us, we're going to see it. You can't decide in advance what you're going to pick out to look at and what you won't. So that isn't going to help you distinguish between what is worth looking at and what is not worth looking at. But in the exercise of your mind, we all have the natural power to turn ourselves away and only to contemplate those objects which we decide on. And so that's what allows us to pursue the best, so that we may not only look at things, but also learn from the things we look at. So what Plutarch is telling us here is that there's a way to train your vision. We walk down the street, we see everything. That isn't going to listen to everything. That isn't going to help us become better people. Vision and hearing by themselves cannot allow us to make the proper distinction. And in a way, this is what Plato is saying too. You walk down the street, you may feel a passion. The eyes want to look. The lower part of the body wants to look. How then do you improve yourself? You improve yourself by contemplation, by thinking what is better and what is worse to look at, what is nobler and what is less noble, and that way you train your appetites. So this is all very true. We learn how to appreciate a view of the better and a view of the worse, but the only point I'm making here is that that innate desire simply to see things has nothing to do with beauty per se. Beauty produces another kind of desire. It produces the kind of desire that we would call erotic attraction, and that's its primary dimension in classical antiquity. Tomorrow, we have 2 sessions. That's for your edification. The first one, I like to look more at the problems I mentioned of sexuality, of class, and of other dimensions in which beauty plays a role in classical antiquity. And then in the afternoon, we're going to look at another set of questions, namely, how did the Greeks analyze beauty? What is it about beauty that works? And that's when we're going to look at symmetry, form, and other kinds of dimensions. And then we'll look finally at Plato and other writers who talk about beauty as being transcendent. Beauty as being something that is beyond the beauty of this world, exists in its own dimension, and is an object not of physical passion, but of mental passion. And then we'll discuss, we'll bring the whole argument to a conclusion. Thank you very much. You want to know more about that weasel?
I have one question, if I may. So, 2 types of beauty represented by two goddesses, 3 goddesses, Aphrodite and Athena. What about the third one, Hera? There were 3 of them who participated in a competition for the title to be the most beautiful.
That's a very, very good question. How did Paris manage to seduce Helen? Well, he was beautiful. But we do know that there was a backstory. A story to which Homer alludes very briefly and cryptically, but he doesn't tell the story. So if you're reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, you won't know the story. But from other poetry and other literature, we know that there was a contest. Well, let me go back a bit. There was a feast among the gods and goddesses. And one goddess was not invited. And her name was Discord. Discord means disharmony, enmity, quarrel. And Quarrel, the goddess of quarrel, wasn't invited. Well, you got to be careful when you insult the goddess of quarrel. So what does she do? she takes a golden apple and she writes on it, "To the most beautiful goddess," and she throws it on the table in the middle of the feast. Well, this is likely to cause competition. And 3 goddesses stand up to be judged. Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera, who is Zeus's wife. So she's the queen of all, God, Zeus's own wife. Not that Zeus doesn't sometimes choose some others, but this is the official wife of Zeus. Okay, I mean, he's the chief god, he has to have some fun. So, they're going to have a competition, and they decide, let's have, who to decide it? Well, they hear about a young shepherd in Troy, who is Paris. And Paris is tending his goats and his sheep out in the countryside, and 3 goddesses appear. And they say, which of us is the most beautiful? Now, you don't have to go very far to figure out who's going to win that contest. Is it going to be the virgin goddess? Is it going to be Papa God's wife? Or is it going to be the goddess of love and sexuality herself? It's the goddess of love and sexuality herself, and she wins. But if that's the case, aren't we having Athena at least pretending to be beautiful, or trying to be beautiful, and represent, and also Hera? So aren't we in a situation, a very odd situation, in which goddesses who really ought to know better, they're not going to win against Aphrodite, not in sexiness, and also who have reasons why they oughtn't, in fact, to look so sexy. And we get this. Euripides writes a play in which Hecuba is criticizing Helen. Hecuba is the wife of the king of Troy, who's been taken captive after the fall of the city. And she is furious at Helen because Helen is responsible for the destruction of her city, the death of every male in the city, and all the women being sold into slavery to be the sexual objects of any man who wants them. This is not good, and it's all Helen's fault. And Hecuba says, don't tell me this story about how the goddesses came and had a competition for beauty. That's just an excuse. What would Athena, the virgin goddess, be doing out there saying, I'm the sexiest? What would Zeus's own wife going out there and claiming I am flirtatious and maybe presenting herself naked so that Paris could judge who's who? This is a fiction. This never happened. So that's the view of Hecuba in a play by Euripides. Well, we could say, okay, this is Euripides' view, but the story is told anyway, so somewhere along the way that story must have had currency. Well, I've told you almost everything about the story, but not quite everything. The goddesses do compete over their beauty, and they do ask Paris to judge. But that doesn't explain how Paris got Helen, does it? The way he got Helen is Aphrodite said, if you judge me to be the most beautiful, I'll give you the most beautiful woman alive. That's how he got Helen. And so he judges that Aphrodite is the most beautiful, and he gets Helen. Well, what did Athena promise him? What did Hera promise him? They promised him power. They promised him authority. They promised him physical abilities. And he chose to have the sexiest woman. But here's a problem. He didn't judge the most beautiful goddess after all, did he? He judged the one who gave him the present, the bride, that he most liked. Well, what was he judging? What was the judgment of Paris? Was he deciding who was the most beautiful goddess? Or was he deciding which of the presents I like best? If you're going to decide, do I want what Athena can give me, military prowess? Do I want what Hera can give me, authority among nations? Or do I want what Aphrodite can give me, the sexiest girl alive? I'm making the choice. Well, then notice how each of the goddesses is associated with a very particular power. And what he's choosing is the sexiness of the sexy goddess over the other qualities she's associated with the other two goddesses. So how do these two stories fit? How can you have a beauty contest when in fact you're not judging by their beauty, you're judging by their bribes? And the bribes aren't all on the same level, they're very different. So is he judging what he prefers? Aphrodite's gift, Athena's gift, or Hera's gift, each one being different? Or is he judging really which is the most beautiful? And scholars have noticed this problem. They've noticed there seem to be two stories merged. One, what do you think is the best thing? And Paris, being a little bit on the foolish side, chooses sex and it gets into trouble. Or a contest of beauty, which could be a contest between three women over beauty, but not those three goddesses, because they don't make sense competing for beauty. You don't compete with the goddess of beauty over beauty. This would be like competing, like Aphrodite entering into a contest of arms with Athena. You're never going to win. Aphrodite is wounded by a mortal in the Iliad. She's not a fighter. So, how did those stories come together? Well, it's an interesting puzzle, and when you write a book on beauty, you get into all this stuff, and I've come up with a tentative answer. We have the Iliad and the Odyssey, but there's a lot of ancient poetry, epic poetry we don't have. And one of those poems is called the Cypria. And Cypria means the woman from Cyprus. Now, who's the woman from Cyprus? It's Aphrodite. Why? Because she had a wonderful temple and a cult on the island of Cyprus that's still parked there in the area called Paphos. And so she was associated with that island in particular. And so she's called the goddess from Cyprus. And that story that Cypria told the whole story of the Iliad. And in it, or the Trojan War, I should say, and in it, there was the judgment of Paris. That we know. And he was something of a comedian, this writer, and something of a clever guy. And he loved stitching stories together and making them funny in this way. And I have the suspicion that he invented this complex version of the tale. And then afterwards, of course, it became current. But he took a story, which was really a story about three women competing for beauty, another story about three women, or maybe three goddesses, competing over their gifts. And he fused the two stories together. And that created this very anomalous situation in which Athena and Hera, who don't stand a chance against Aphrodite, actually will engage into a competition over beauty. I hope that was something of an answer. And if not, at least that it was entertaining. But I did have to go into her in the book.
You said that you would investigate how these two words, kalos and kalos, are implied in relation to class, goddesses, and what was it, sexuality. You didn't mention works of art.
That will be...
When you think, like, for example, you spoke about the Iliad, and the most obvious example is the shield of Achilles, and I wonder whether either of these two words is used.
A very, very good question. The question, just in case anyone didn't hear it in the back, was I didn't mention works of art in my... This will be the second lecture tomorrow. Yes, I will include, when I said I will discuss form and proportion in relation to works of art, we will look at how kalos is used. But let me anticipate in answer to this question. I did mention very briefly that I haven't found the word kalos applied to an entire work of art. It's a feature of works of art. And one of the questions I will raise, but we've already raised it in relation to the statue of Artemis. If I showed you a beautiful statue of Apollo, and I say that's a beautiful statue, what do I mean? Do I mean it is that Apollo is looking beautiful in the statue, or that the statue is beautiful independently of the way Apollo looks? You see the problem here? Sometimes when I have the word applied to the statue, it can be ambiguous. It mean It's the statue of a beautiful man. And if I were to show you an ugly old figure, maybe I wouldn't call that statue beautiful. And I will be looking into exactly that kind of question. What the contexts are in which this word for beauty is applied to it. One of the issues is that the adjective kalos can be applied to works of art, but then it tends to mean something slightly different. I'll give you one example from Plutarch. I was going to quote it tomorrow, but in answer to your question, I think it will be helpful. Plutarch is not describing now beauty, but he's describing virtuous characters. This is an essay he wrote on how young people should appreciate poetry. Now, why does he write this essay? Because Plato, and Plutarch was an admirer of Plato, Plato had said that poets like Homer and the tragedians should be banished from the ideal city. Why? Because they told stories about people and about the gods that are unworthy of the divine, unworthy of heroism, and they offer bad models for behavior. We should not have tragedy, and we should not have Homer and epic poetry in our ideal city. They shouldn't be taught and they shouldn't be recited. And they were recited and performed everywhere. Now, if you think Plato is being really narrow-minded, and his writings were in some ways the inspiration for Stalin's Commissar of Art, this is actually true, we ought nevertheless to think that we ourselves believe that certain kinds of television shows are inappropriate for young people, that they shouldn't be shown at certain hours or made available to everyone. There is a wide issue in the United States about censorship of the internet, where all kinds of pornography and violence and terrible things are shown. They are not made accessible in schools and in libraries that children may attend. And Plato is thinking about training children. He's thinking about the kinds of things that young people listen to and see all the time in the city, and he doesn't want it. And here comes Plutarch centuries later, and he's writing a little essay for a friend of his who has about a 12-year-old son, just like Plutarch's own son. And he's saying, well now, how are we going to let these kids read poetry when Plato tells us how bad the effects are? He's worried about the consequences of these evil representations. He doesn't want to see goddesses competing for beauty out there and all these other terrible stories. Well, Plutarch says you can do it if you prepare the children properly so that they know how to read. You have to have them take a distance. He says you must make them, you must start with, they must not worship either the poets or the characters in the poetry. They mustn't do it on bended knee. They must always read critically. They must read against the text. They must fight with the text. They can challenge it. They can say, this is immoral. There are many strategies for which to do it. And one of them, he says this. He says, just because a poem is well made doesn't mean that its subject matter is good. So I can write a very beautiful poem about people who do terrible things. And what the students have to learn is the fact that the poem is well made doesn't mean that the characters in it are good and are models to imitate. Similarly, I can make a work of art that is well made, but I don't necessarily mean that the characters in it are nobly read or noble or are beautiful. And here's the clue, and here where I end. What is the language that he uses? He says a poem or a speech or a work of art, literature, can be made kalos. Now, the pronunciation kalos is an adverb. In other words, finely. It can be well done. It's the same kalos. It can be made kalos, but that doesn't mean the things in it are kala. So you see the distinction that he's drawing. you can do something that as a work of art is very fine, but the things in it aren't necessarily fine. That's his distinction, and he's not the only one who makes it. What the Greeks normally, not always, meant by a work of art, especially literature, being fine, is that it was an accurate representation. In other words, if I am going to show you, and next time I'm going to show you some images of, for example, a very old woman with a very horrible face. And what that image can, and we would be describing that's in connection with other things, but that image could be described as very well made because it exactly captures how such a kind of a woman would look. But am I going to say that that woman is either noble or beautiful? No. And that's a distinction that I want to draw next time with regard to works of art. And that will be the second issue that we were looking at last time in the contradictions in modern conceptions of beauty. Can you have a work of art that you would call beautiful even though the figure in it is not? The other one was, can you have a distinction between spiritual beauty and physical beauty represented in the same work? And both times I'm going to say ancient Greek conceptions of beauty were not vulnerable to this kind of dilemma. And the larger conclusion is going to be, well, not a conclusion, a question for all of us, how can we make use of ancient Greek notions to help us rethink problems of beauty so that a new modern aesthetics that doesn't deny beauty but absorbs it into a larger context could be functional. Does that help?